Once more, for the recording, I'm Philippa Hardman. I'm one of the co-founders of GameShift. And as I say, we're really delighted to welcome you to this very special pop-up. So, Chris, my co-founder, do you want to say something
Uh,
and then
I,
hand
I
over?
I do. I'm delighted to say something. Just that I'm thrilled it's happening because when I think back of the experiences that have changed my life, actually so many of them are coming together on this call. Um, my time in Ashford Consulting and doing the master's degree there with Bill absolutely shaped my consulting practice. I see that we have Anne Welsh on the call. Anne, my time on the master's degree, the psychosynthesis training with you and others, um, was huge, played a huge part in who I am. And Jean, our work at Schumacher and all that time working at Schumacher is another huge part. So various things are coming together. It's just wonderful to see you. And I'm particularly delighted that John and Bill are going to lead us into a conversation because the two of you have worked together for a long time and have written things together. And I'm just so pleased you could do it. So can I just get out of your way, John, and let you lead us into this rather lovely thing?
Right. Well, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Philippa. And I think, Rick, you're going to spotlight Bill and myself so that we're then the center of everybody's attention. Now, Bill and I did meet up at Tate Modern last week in preparation for this. So, and Bill, I sort of remember asking, he asked, should I prepare some slides, some points? And I was thinking, but Bill, you're one of the great raconteurs. I mean, basically, get Bill talking, and it's great. So I'm hoping that he hasn't prepared too many slides or too many bullet points, and that our preamble conversation was enough to get his juices going.
What a slide in sight.
My slide into this, and by the way, we're probably going to be in conversation for about 20 to 40 minutes. We really something like that. And do pop your questions up in the chat during that time. I'll keep an eye on them. So if something comes up, I'll feed them through to Bill. So I've told him not to worry about the chat so he can concentrate on those things. After about that 20 to 40 minutes, we'll then go into more sort of conversational format where I will sort of step back and it will be all of us in conversation with Bill. Now, the first question I asked Bill, which is something I ask anybody who's written a book or collated their life's work in some sort of narrative form, is what made you write this book? What made you pull everything together, Bill?
Well, it started really with my son, Alexander, who asked me to write the story of my life before I popped me clogs, as they say up north. So I wrote the story of my life, and he sent it back with a B-, saying it needs further work. So I clearly left out some early romantic details which he thought ought to be included. So this idea of writing the story of my life started there, I suppose. He did threaten to be on this call, but whether he's made it is another matter. The second thing is I noticed I supervise quite a few coaches and OD consultants, and I was quite often using material that I'd got somewhere in my files and saying, well, you might find this useful because it seemed to be what we were talking about. And then I started to realize, well, I've got quite a lot of material, some published, some unpublished. And what a pity just to leave it littered across my computer files. And maybe I should put it all together and make it available. And that was it, really. I suppose I have to own to a certain amount of hubris in that I thought people might find it useful. And that I have a sense that if much of what I've written, if consultants by and large were influenced by it, they might actually find it quite useful. In the same way that I wrote a book called Letters to a Leader recently, and I kind of hubristically think if leaders would follow the principles in my book, we'd have better organization. So I'm owning a bit of hubris, but on the whole, I just thought I need to make this available to people. So that was it, really.
Well, let's move on to what for me was one of the foundational experiences of my professional life, which was joining AC. I think it was in '97, and was that when AMOC was launched, the Ashridge Masters in Organizational Consulting, or was it in 98, 97, 98?
I'm not good on dates, John.
Okay.
Honestly, it infuriates my wife. I've never can remember when we had who to dinner. And I can't even remember their names, let alone the dates. So it would have been about that time. I think that's right.
And I remember, I mean, it's not a word I suspect, that gets bandied around quite lightly. But Chris, when he was sending out the invite for this, referred to you as a pioneer. So what? I mean, I'll talk about my own experience first, and then get you to sort of reflect more deeply about the AMOC experience. But it is around that AMOC was pioneering. I mean, I remember I joined AC and then got involved with the Masters, coming from a mainstream consulting background. I worked for a firm called A.T. Kearney, very classic US management consultancy. And walking into AC, encountering AMOC was, to borrow the thing that now hackneyed cliche, it was my red pill moment. It was suddenly I saw the world completely differently. And I tumbled down the rabbit hole of what on earth consulting was, and I'm still tumbling. But I've stopped worrying about tumbling now. But having talked sort of about the impact it had on me personally, for you, how pioneering was it? Why did it matter to you? What did it stand for?
When I arrived in Ashridge, I arrived with a Gestalt perspective. I was already a practicing psychotherapist, and one of the adages in Gestalt: if you really want to change, concentrate on what is. So don't try and make things happen. Really immerse people in what's really going on here, which of course implies having conversations that they wouldn't normally have. So I arrived with this perspective, and it frightened Ashridge people to death. They thought I was from another planet, really, running workshops and inviting people to focus on the present. And then I got involved with Ralph Stacey, and I got interested in the idea of organizations as complex social processes. And it's really important to honor one's influences. I mean, I learned a great deal from Ralph. And so I was starting to work from these two principles of organizations as social processes and the Gestalt principle of privileging the present moment, privileging relationship, what's going on between people. And people started to say, shouldn't we be promulgating this? And so in the bath, in the proverbial bath, I thought, I know, I'll create a master's degree. Now, I hadn't got a clue how to create a master's degree, by the way, not having any feet in academia. So it's also important to say that I enlisted the help of a guy called Camille Kellner, who was working at City University, to help me turn my ideas into a master's program. And a guy called David Fisher, and these are people that often don't get named, had always been saying, come on, Bill, we must publish what you're doing. So I formed a team with those two, and we got the thing accredited in 6 months, which apparently it should have taken us 2 years. Because I started off as an innocent. I was expecting it would be easy. It wasn't easy, but it was easier than other people have found it, apparently. And so it started off as an integration of Gestalt ideas, a Gestalt orientation, actually. I think Gestalt is a way of being in the world. Someone called Gay Houston said there's something right-minded about Gestalt, because it puts a lot of emphasis on the quality of contact between people. What kind of conversations are they actually having? And it also places a lot of emphasis on bringing the full person into the room. It's actually essentially an embodied approach. And combining that with this idea that organizations are not things at all, they have no material entity, they are in fact people communicating with each other, seem to fit very well with this Gestalt idea. Organizations as processes of communication. I've always liked that way of describing an organization, as a process of organization. So the Gestalt ideas and this perspective on organizations as an entirely relational and also complex process in which you cannot trace linear effect because it's excuse me, it's dynamic and non-linear.
Yeah, let Bill take some water there for a
Yeah,
second.
I'll take a quick glass of water. So I don't think it's a prolonged affliction.
I was just thinking, and it's not gin, as Chris was
I missed that
earlier.
thing. So and then what we started this, and then one of my closest colleagues, Adrian McLean, arrived on the faculty, and they brought with it appreciative inquiry. So it became an integration of appreciative inquiry, Gestalt, and organizations as social processes. And it was radical. There was no question. There was nothing like it. I pioneered in the sense of bringing these three things together into a radical synthesis of organization consulting. But as always, I stood on the shoulders of giants, and whoever created Gestalt, and also Ralph. And so that was it, really. And yeah, I'll stop there. See where you're going to take me next and surprise me, because I can't remember.
Well, partly because you've crashed through about the two or the three that neatly packeted together. Because
John, can I just ask? There was a name missing, and you could tell me you're coming to it later, or it's not related to the story. I always thought David Casey was entwined in. Or have I stolen the question that comes later?
Well,
In which case,
thank you very much, Chris. That's fine. You know, I was
I'll
about to ask
I'll just
your
be quiet.
mentors.
I'll just be quiet. I'll go away.
Your mentors, Bill, that we spontaneously I'm bringing up now, also included, along with Ralph Stacey, David Casey, and Petrushka Clarkson. Would you like to say a bit about those two as influences in your professional career?
So I was going to do that anyway, and I thought I better let you have the prompt you were supposed to have. Yes, well, actually, quite right. And one of the things that this has made me think about is the importance of mentors in one's life. And I have been heavily influenced by three mentors. And the first was a guy called David Casey, you're quite right, who was the first person who, said to me, you're an OD consultant, Bill, because I met him when I was a marketing consultant. Actually, no, I wasn't. I was a strategy consultant. I wasn't much good as a strategy consultant because I can't do numbers, really. And you've got to do numbers to be a good strategy consultant, or at least you had in those days. So he says, you're an OD consultant. And we did some team development work together. And we then wrote what became quite a seminal article called Second Thoughts on Team Building, which challenged the rather romantic idea that in teams all hearts ought to be open and all desires known, and we must all love one another, and suggested actually teams in organizations are never going to be like that, so let's stop trying to make them like that. So we wrote this article. We did a lot of work together. We wrote another called Organizations Get Stuck To, which actually drew on transaction analysis and Gestalt. So he was a major influence on my life. And oddly enough, when we got AMOC accredited, you have to have some friendly person on the panel. So David was a friendly person. He told me afterwards it would never have got through if it hadn't been for him. That's a bit David for you. I didn't really believe that. But anyway, I'm sure he made a very important contribution. So he was a major source. And you mentioned Patricia.
Petrushka. Petrushka, you told me.
No, that could be a bit confusing now. On the subject of mentors, when I was at Shepherd Moscow, that was my first OD company, when I arrived there as a makey-learny, and I think I got in on false pretenses because I'd been in group therapy, I kind of intuitively knew stuff, but I didn't have any skill. So I thought I was in danger of being thrown out. So I asked somebody what I should do, and they recommended me Patricia Clarkson, who went on to form metanoia psychotherapy training. And I worked with her. I trained with her, I supervised with her, she supervised me. And so she was the person who really taught me Gestalt. And a lot more than that, I would say. She was a genius in a way. So yes, but the last person is that brought me into Ashridge Consulting. I then joined a PhD group with Ralph and Patricia Shaw. And Patricia Shaw and I pioneered some approaches to consulting based on our early understanding of complexity theory. So she also was a major influence. We did a lot of rather scary work together. She was far more adventurous than me. Shall I tell you the quick story of my...
I was just about to prompt you. Can you tell me the story of working with Patricia Shaw and sitting in an office and looking at, yes, tell me the story that you might have said before.
Well, it's just an example, I think, of how radically different our approach was. Most consultancies would go in and do a diagnosis, produce proposals and things of that sort. We got an assignment to address culture in a local authority, quite a big one. And we had a very enlightened chief executive who he basically said, we need to change the culture, but he did not lay out the new culture he wanted to get to. He just said, look, our culture by implication is command and control and rather autocratic, and we need to change it. And so we persuaded him that we would want to do it by simply walking around the organization, consulting by walking around and meeting people and discovering from them what was going on. Now, I thought that was pretty wacky. And the first thing we did was to put a notice in the organization's newsletter to say that Bill Critchley and Patricia Shaw will be sitting in such and such a room on such and such a day. And if you'd like to come and talk to them about culture, they would be very pleased to see you. And by the way, the chief executive had written a letter saying, these guys, or you'll meet them, do give them your time and attention. So we sent this note out, and HR said, oh, no one's going to come. And we said, why not? And they said, well, because we haven't told them to. So we said, well, that's interesting. And so we sat there and waited. Now, I would never have had the courage to do this on my own without Patricia. But 3 or 4 people turned up, and we had a good conversation, and we gave them tea and biscuits, by the way, that helped. And then the next session, another 4 or 5 people turned up, and then suddenly 18 people turned up, because word got round that people were getting listened to, and we started to get sense of the culture, but we had no idea what to do after that. And so at a time we thought, why don't we have a large group, and we'll bring all these people, invite all these people to come to a large group, and we'll invite the chief executive, and we'll invite the chair of the governors and what have you. And so it was a very emergent process of bringing people into conversations about what's going on around here. So it was a kind of inquiry, although that isn't a word we'd learned to use. We learned to use this idea of an inquiry-based approach later. So, but the very first entry into this organization, Patricia and I said, well, go on, we've got to get our security passes. Let's start with them and then see where we go. And as I say, it was far more courageous than I could have done on my own. So I learned a lot from her in how to take courage as this kind of consultant, because I think it takes courage. Right, pause.
Got two more questions before we sort of open it up to people. But I'll give them both to you, and you can choose which one you want to play with. one, you were saying in our conversation that we were talking about, actually they overlap, recurring themes in your practice that have stood out for you. And I've made a note here, which is a lot of them, the recurring themes, are bound up with your relationship to particular types of authority. So why don't you sort of riff on that?
Is that one question or two?
It's sort of one and a half.
I thought I had a choice.
Well, I realized halfway through it wasn't really a choice, but you could step back from the question of your authority, deny that this has anything to do with your identity, and just talk about your themes as if they were something detached from you. Or you could engage with them as a process of personal inquiry.
Well, I was asked the other day what mattered to me, because in an assignment I'm currently embarking on, it's around purpose. And this person wanted to start off asking everyone, what is your purpose? And I said, don't be ridiculous. I can't answer that question just out of the blue. What is my purpose as what? A father, a husband, what? And so they changed they said, well, what matters to you? And I started off by saying, well, I think what matters to me is I get very riled by autocracy, by having things imposed on me. And then I started to think that most of my work in organizations, and this is retrospectively, has been about trying to create the conditions in which authority is distributed. And trying to challenge command and control as a way of running organizations, trying to challenge the idea that one or two people at the top monopolize wisdom, and that really leadership is about convening the wisdom in the organization. And so I realized that I've been standing against authoritarianism in my own way, and interested in focusing on the local, empowering people. I don't like the word empowering, but empowering people to take local initiatives rather than cascade things down. And it's not dissimilar from your work with Megan, is it, on speaking truth to power? We've got very common approaches. Can I tell a story about you, John?
Oh, God, okay.
I must just tell you that when I did my first bit of work with John, and we went to a mental health authority, and the idea was that we were doing a presentation, and we'd start by inviting them all to introduce themselves. And we arrived, and we were a bit surprised to see a phalanx of people sitting before us. And as we sat down, John immediately opened his mouth and went into the presentation. And I said, hang on a second, John. I thought we were going to start finding out a bit about them. And John goes, oh, silly me. And everyone fell about laughing. And of course, we got the work.
Yes, it was very, I always liked it. It was Kim De Morgan was with us, and she brought a certain energy with her in her work. I always remember her once saying she was having her coaching work assessed, and she had this beautiful habit of oversharing. And in any conversation, in any context, she would suddenly say, are we oversharing at this moment? Away from the anecdotes, I'm going to turn to the chat and sort of throw the floor open once I've asked my own question at this point to people. And again, put it in the chat, or if we can have it full screen so I can see the full gallery, then I can see if people put their hands up or something. And it goes back to one of your early things, which with your Gestalt influence, and about the importance of paying attention to the present. And I'm just really struck by, because it's such a persistent pattern, we're still quite stuck in it. But why don't people in organizational settings pay attention to the present?
It's a good question, isn't it? What people do in the organizations is they either analyze the past or they write aspirational stuff about the future, and they do not pay attention to what's going on now. So I think one of the reasons, there are a number of reasons they don't do that. I think for many leaders, it's too boring. It's looking at the nitty gritty, and it's not very interesting. They're much more excited to be creating grand visions. Another reason I think is that quite often it would involve looking at the gap between what is being espoused and what is actually going on. That would be another reason. And I think the third, John, which is your reason really, is that although speaking truth to power is a lovely ideal, my experience is that people are very cautious about saying something that might upset authority. And you might be able to bracket that when you're in a workshop. But on the whole, I once had a very good meeting with someone doing some work with a long time ago with 3M. And he told me a lot of this sort of real stuff. And then at the end of this meeting, I said, so I assume you're going to be open about this in the meeting we're going to have. And he looked at me, he said, don't be silly. I'm not going to risk my career by saying some of these things, as if it was obvious that he wasn't going to. And I think we just underestimate the culture. The culture. It's not necessarily fear, but it's the culture of people being careful about what they say, whether they are going to say something contrary to what leaderships. And as we know, nowadays, that is being exacerbated by all kinds of other things people have to be careful about not saying. Does that answer your question, John?
That's good. I just was hitting over. I've got one question in the chat. So, and again, I'm not going to name people who've put this out unless they sort of explicitly say, I'll read their questions out. Again, it helped from sort of the recording point of view and preserves anonymity. But again, if you're happy to break anonymity, then do put your hand up. Jean, you're okay to be named, are you?
Yes,
okay.
I am.
Jean, would you like to read out the question that you put in the chat?
Yeah, yes, I would. Thank you. It was just what I've been reflecting on, Bill, as you talked. I trained in Gestalt as well, and came across Gestalt at the same time as complexity, and indeed remember going to Metanoia and doing a weekend workshop with Ralph and Patricia together, which was quite, the start of my journey with complexity. But one of the things I notice in the field of complexity is, complexity theory means very different things to different people, doesn't it? There's unfortunately many complexities, which is very confusing for people. But I wondered if you could talk a bit about how, for you, those two ideas have entwined, and what your complexity worldview would be. What would be your take on that, and how those two have kind of influenced your thinking?
I'll do my best. I think Ralph started his explorations with looking at complexity in science and mathematics and all that kind of stuff. And he started initially saying we can learn something about this. And then he realized he was making a category error in that he was taking a theory of science into a social field. And you can't just make a simple translation. It's a bit like saying sports coaches can apply sports coaching to managing organizations. You can't. They're two totally different areas of activity. So he gradually evolved something that related much more to organizations. And he drew heavily, as you probably know, on Norbert Elias and George Mead. George Mead famously saying the meaning of the gesture is in the response. So, and both of them, those two writers were interested in, Elias was particularly interested in the way people form their identities in groups. Mead was particularly interested in the way communication, we can't get messages out of one head into another. We have to realize that people will make their own sense. So he really synthesized some sociological ideas with the core message of complexity, which is the non-linear nature of causality. So that in an organization, conducting an inquiry into what went wrong is largely a waste of time, because there's never ever going to be one cause, that everything is causing each other simultaneously. And I think that combines with a nice idea from Gestalt, and also, by the way, from the systems people like Václavic, Wheatland and Fish, who used to said, the why isn't interesting. All that's interesting is, what are you going to do next? We spend so much time analyzing the why. How did we get here? But actually, Gestalt is very interesting. In Gestalt says, well, we are where we are. What are the creative possibilities here? What are the experiments we might conduct? And I think that's very congruent with this social process view. So in summary, the bit of the, as you say, the wide field of complexity that interests me is the non-linear dynamic nature of organizations, and the fact that things are happening between people and constantly being co-created. And that's about it. I don't confuse people with long presentations about butterflies flapping their wings and all that kind of stuff. I do think, one last thing though, I do think that Stuart Coffin, who was, he looked at complexity in natural systems, and the early work of the complexity theories was to discover that pattern emerged, not necessarily the pattern you predicted or wanted, but patterns emerge, and they did this by some computer experiments, and he said, rather like whoever it was shouted eureka, he said, isn't it marvelous? Order emerges for free. You don't have to make it happen. And that's also something I suggest to managers. You spend far too much time trying to make things happen, make order happen. It's the basis of a good empowerment. Set up people a few parameters, and then within those parameters, encourage them to find their best way of doing something. So that's another part of complexity which I work with.
Okay. I'm just going to read
Right,
out
a thumbs up. That's good. I can.
I've got another question here, which is Rachel Janaway, who's happy to be named but can't go on camera as she's out with the dogs. Question for you, Bill. I'm interested to know what Bill thinks about the way the world of work is changing due to AI, and how that will influence OD and consultancy in the future. Lightweight question for you, Bill. If you can predict that for the next 5-10 years, that'd be fine.
I'm not really sure that I can answer that question any better than any of you guys. I suppose my concern is that people think that robots, AI, somehow replace the need for embodied contact, replace relationship. And my own sense is, I was quite interested in my practice after COVID. Quite a few people in my practice decided this is very comfortable, I'm going to stay at home and do it virtually. And then I've met a lot of people trying to make the case that you can have embodied contact virtually, and I don't buy that. So I think one of the real risks is that people lose the sense of and the importance of two people in a room together where bodies literally resonate. I don't believe you get that kind of resonance. So that's my bother about the spread of AI. I, by the way, use ChatGPT, and I marvel at how quickly it comes up with interesting answers to things. But, you know, all I'm saying is, if we use it as a tool, great. If you use it as a substitute for the real stuff of coaching and OD, not great.
Thank you. Any I'm looking for any.
John, I think Anne Welsh, was trying to raise a hand. Anne, if you can hear me, because she raised her hand and disappeared from my screen.
I can see. Yes, your hand is up, Anne.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Good. So thank you. I've really enjoyed what I've heard so far. And apart from Chris Nichols and Philippa, I really don't know anyone here. So it's good to meet all these people. But what I'm with, and I'm at the elder stage of my life, is I'm bored out of my mind with this work. Not because I don't like the work, I love the work, but something is trying to come in. And when you're talking about the here and now, Bill, and you're saying what's going to make a difference, I think we really need to think what needs to change, or what's the difference we need to make in the here and now. And there's something that I'm with around consciousness and the difference between how we've worked from masculine consciousness in our field and how do we bring in more feminine consciousness. And I don't mean that obviously with men and women, but I think there's such a need for change and really working in relationship to others in the here and now, in the work that we do. How do we shift it? Because you're talking a language that most people on this screen seem to understand already. So how do we get something new in? How do we bring in something new? That's my question.
Thank you, Anne.
Well, I think that's a good question for Philippa and or Chris to answer.
I'm going to not let you duck that, Bill. They can come in at a certain point, but you kick it off, and then we'll
We are
ask.
merely the hosts, Bill. You're the invited guest.
So if I'm understanding your question, first of all, you said that you think everyone here accepts this idea of paying more attention to the present moment. And actually, I wouldn't quite agree with you.
I didn't say that. I didn't say it clearly for you then. I was saying that you said that. I think everyone in the room understands the content of what you're bringing in terms of your work, but I didn't say they're all comfortable in working in the here and now with what's happening.
Okay. Because I'm sorry if I misunderstood you, but see, I think the idea of actually looking someone in the eye and having a real robust conversation in an organization is still pretty new. I don't see it happen very often. So the new thing for me in organizations, and I've been saying it for a long time, if I'm working with a team of people, is they do actually start speaking honestly to each other. And they do start talking about the elephants in the room, to use that cliche. So I think that is, oddly enough, it's still radical. And in my experience, when you get people, I'm sure you're familiar with that dialogue notion from what's that philosopher's name? I always forget. I, it, and I, thou. Come on, John, help me.
Buber.
Yeah,
Buber.
I, it, and I, thou. Yeah. It's my experience that I, thou moments are where change happens, where something really shifts. When you allow yourself literally to be vulnerable and they allow themselves to be vulnerable. So we both let go our control and open ourselves to the other, which for many people is a scary moment, because in that moment, our self is undergoing change. Now, I don't think that's either the masculine principle or the feminine principle. I just think that's a universal. It's possible that women are better at that than men. I think that's a possibility. But so I suppose that's the best I can do. That for me is still novel. Real dialogue is still vanishingly unusual in organizations.
Thank you. I mean, I imagine, and I can feel it from you already, that you do that. I think that most or a lot of consultants don't do it at all. When I've met up with OD, HR people, they cannot really speak openly in the here and now. That's been my experience. You have to speak a language that only they understand.
And it's interesting that John, we had a bit of a joke about whether I prepared some slides, and John knowing perfectly well that I never use slides. And whenever I worked with a senior team a while back, and I discovered that whenever anybody's asked to address a topic, they arrive with a pack of 32 slides. If you think about that, that's one of the most common ways of in Gestalt, we call it deflection, deflecting away from responding to what is really being asked about. You could call it distraction, if you like. So I insist that we conduct workshops without slides. Maybe a 2-pager just to summarize the topic. Now, see, since I started, slides have become even more a relied on vehicle. So I think there are still many novel things we can do that will disrupt organizations if we help them to start really talking to each other.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Bill. There's another question. And again, I'm not going to name the person as they haven't given me the clearance for this yet, but this is a change of more of a reflective question for you, Bill. As this is a reflection over your career, what do you think the biggest shift has been in consulting to organizations over the last few decades? It might fit with what you've just been saying. Have the perspectives you've developed and worked with changed the field of OD and organizations?
I would have to say, in my experience, no. So one of the things I carry with me, I don't brood on it. Have I made much difference? Do we make any difference? Not sure. When people ask me what my purpose is these days, I say laughingly, or no, wryly, changing the world one person at a time. So I think what we do often change individuals in organizations, but I think a lot of OD consulting is grandiose. The whole idea that we can change an organization by a wonderful project is pretty grandiose. I mean, it takes me 3 years working in psychotherapy with one person sometimes to bring about any significant change. So how are we going to create a change in a whole organization? So I do wonder about that. But there are some examples. Who was it? Who are the firm that makes Ganex? Is it W.L. Gore, isn't it?
Yeah.
So there are organizations, I mean, they have, for example, a rule, never make an important decision without consulting some good people. They also have an idea that if we have a number of parameters and clear rules, we can allow people to find their own way. So there are examples out there as a counter to my perhaps rather downbeat view. But there's still a lot of work for us to be done, because particularly when people are under economic pressure, they default usually to a very task-orientated, non-dialogic, non-relational, often quite command and control mode. So it's a bit depressing, isn't it? We haven't had much of an effect more generally. But that's my view. What do other people think?
Well, just to respond to what you just said, Bill, reminds me of Brian Goodwin, who a lovely phrase. Don't forget, human systems in crisis tend towards control, and you just see it again and again and again. And even when you embark on really participative work, and the people with formal power in the organization are fully behind doing this work, as unexpected events inevitably unfold in that process, it can often then tend towards control. And I think this becomes ever more topical as we're facing, this multiple pile of crises that we're facing as a society. There's more and more control cropping up.
I was just thinking, on the upside though, we talked about my mentors and my work with David Casey, and David Casey and I did quite a long piece of work with an organization. Took us about 6 months, and we did some really interesting things. We thought really interesting things. So, for example, we used transaction analysis theory of games, and we invited them to look at what games they played. We gave them a bit of theory, and they were very creative in spotting all the games they played. And I think that kind of work is really useful because it helps organizations to notice their patterns, the norms and the patterns that they are beholden to, that they're enthralled to. So we did all that. And then we had the final moment when we sat with the leadership team for a review of how did this go. And I was sitting there looking forward to them telling us about what I thought of as our pyrotechnics, how brilliant they'd been. And there's a silence, and they looked at us and they said, it's you two. And I thought, pardon? It's you two. And I didn't know what they meant until they said, it's the way you are together. That's what's extraordinary. And I think it's easy to underestimate in our work, just our way of being willing to disagree with one another quite openly and easily, and it not to end in anything serious. Just are willing to, as I say, operate in dialogue. So I think we can underestimate the difference we can make just by showing up as us, and letting go the paraphernalia of product. I'm about to do an assignment at the moment, and I'm noticing that, as so many of OD change projects are, we've got a solution in search of a problem. That's what most L&D or HRD people want to do, because it's measurable, it's quantifiable, and it ticks all the boxes. So, we've got this amazing solution, which we then impose on the organization. Time and time again, we do this, and it just bumps off the organization. Doesn't make any difference at all. So what I've been arguing for years is, let's not come up with solutions. Let's start off with inquiry and really invite people to talk about their experience. Clearly, you give an area of concern. It might be culture, it might be sustainability, it might be what should our strategy be. How can we improve? How can we deal with the difficulty that some women are experiencing making it to the top of organization? Whatever the topic is, start with an inquiry, and out of that inquiry emerges what needs to be done. So, but most of our clients, that doesn't work because they need to put money on it. We need to go through procurement, and we need to tell them what the outcomes are. So there's a lot that works against the kind of approach to OD that I'm advocating.
I'm just going to read out a comment from Jean that I think builds on that. And then I'm going to go back. There's a question from Seema Aurora. And again, both of these are clear to use their name. So Jean's comment was, regarding control, and I think this applies to what you've just been saying, I wonder if the other factor that plays out increasingly is holding on to power.
Is what?
Holding on to power.
Well, obviously. It's very interesting, isn't it? I mean, we don't start off narcissists, but when we get a lot of power and we get a lot of people, acolytes around us, it strokes our narcissism to the point we very much want to hang on to it.
Yeah. Let me go on to Seema's question at this point. It was very generous of Bill to share the PDF of all his stories and hard-earned lessons. Would he mind talking about his thoughts on shadow consulting and parallel consulting? Maybe something along the lines of what it is and how to do it well, or whatever comes to mind.
So parallel consulting. I don't think I think the word I use is parallel process and shadow consulting. But yeah, I'm willing to talk about that. The notion is, let's start with something. If you've got a team of consultants, let's say 3 or 4 OD consultants, and they're working on a culture change project, what quite often happens is that the patterns in the organization, and I think when we talk about culture, what we're talking about is patterns of interaction, taken for granted assumptions, rituals, that constitutes culture, norms, values. Quite often what happens is that the consulting team starts to exhibit the same patterns in the consulting team. So because they're in a sense, they're participating in a field of interaction, they start interacting in the way that field interacts. So that's what I mean by parallel process. Now, the trick is if the consulting team is willing to stop, and they normally need to get a shadow consultant, someone who sits with them and notices how the team is working together, to say, isn't that interesting? You're talking about this problem in your client, but I wonder whether that's also going on in this team as well. And if you actually pay real attention to that, two things happen. First of all, it's very diagnostic. The team says, oh, Lord, good heavens, yes, you're quite right. We hadn't realized that. There's something going on in the client which we haven't spotted. And then we can then change the way we behave. And by engaging in the organization differently, we may disrupt that pattern. So, John, have I described, and you understand this, have I?
Yeah.
Have I been...
That was a good enough. I'm sort of, as always, I warned you I'd be doing this. I'm sort of 90% listening to you, and I'm also tracking the chat. There's one thing I was going to ask Rick, if he could put or somebody could put a link into the PDF copy of Bill's collection of work, his book, so that's widely available. Someone's just asked, oh, it's just gone in there. Great. Now, I've also had a direct message from someone, and again, so this is a broader question for Bill, which is, as I listen to Bill, I'm reminded of the difference and importance of a philosophy of the world and ideological beliefs about how the world should be. Would be interested to hear Bill's views on the implications of these for practice.
Can you say it again? I think
it's quite a chunky question.
A chunky question, that, isn't it?
As I listen to Bill, I'm reminded of the difference and importance of a philosophy of the world and ideological beliefs about how the world should be. Would be interested to hear Bill's views of the implications of these for practice.
Okay, so if I can, a philosophy of the world. Well, when I was running the masters and it segued into a doctoral program, we used to spend a lot of time, as Chris will remember this fondly or not fondly, about ontology and epistemology. So I think this is an ontological question. The philosophy of the world, how do you understand the way things are? And so what I'm offering here is an ontology of organizations, but it's also of social process. I suppose my ontology is that all social process is about dynamic connection. It's about patterns of connection and emergence and how they give rise to all the things they give rise to. But if we pay attention, it's also a systemic view. But so that's, I suppose my ontology is a relational ontology. I'm not very interested in things described as things and its. Let's be interested in how social processes emerge. That's my ontology. Now the second question is about ideology. I'm very wary of ideology. People often say, I believe this. And I will say, well, do you believe it or do you think it? Because as soon as something becomes a belief, it becomes impossible to, what's the word I'm looking for?
Critique, challenge?
Critique, yes, thank you. I mean, people's beliefs become very fixed. Ideology, I think, is the cause of so much strife, war, whatever you like to call it. So I'm not very keen on ideologies. Now, you might say that my view of organizations is an ideology. I don't think it is. I think it's been very well thought through, but I'm always open to someone saying, actually, Bill, there's another way of thinking. So if we stay with thinking instead of believing, that's what I'm very keen on. I think it's very helpful for us to help managers to think about how they think. What are your assumptions about what is your ontology about organizations and how they work? And you'll find they've probably never really raised that question. And one of the difficulties is not just managers, but politicians. They seem to have a preoccupation with doing. They need to be seen to do. But it's also the doing is often displacement activity. They're doing because it's more comfortable to do than to face up to the imponderable and difficult existential questions. I've also quite liked the existential approach. Often the existential approach is about life is unpredictable. Anxiety is inevitable because people don't like unpredictability. So therefore we avoid the uncomfort of not knowing by through displacement activity. And I think organizations do that in spades. So I'm inclined to want to deconstruct ideals, deconstruct beliefs, and as far as possible, invite people to think really well about how they think this organization works, what they think about the nature of their leadership. How am I doing on that question?
I'm actually going to ask for people to give you a bit of a pause, because I think you've been talking hard for quite a while now, and I just ask for people to speak out loud and reflect on what they've heard. So I'll just pause it, take as long as it likes, but it would be lovely to hear some other voices at this point. And if I was Bill, and I'll see whether he nods at me, I'd like to hear how what he's been saying is landing with people. Yes, we've got a nice questions. There's something about breaking the Q&A pattern at this point, to just change how this is going. So just unmute yourself and speak when the spirit moves you about how this is landing with you, where you are now.
In fact, actually, could we get Rick to unmute everyone? But then it's easy for people just to join in, and just feel free to speak up. Don't feel you need to raise your hand like you're in school, but feel free to do that as well if you want to be picked by John, but otherwise just shout.
Raise my hand and speak up. It's an interesting reaction. So thank you, Philippa, for opening up the floor, and John. So nice to see you all here. And I'm just trying to tune into my body because I'm starting to feel a little bit overwhelmed by the memory and connection that I feel with you, Bill. And not having had years of speaking to you, but hearing everything you've shared just now. So I'm just taking a breath. But I've loved this. I've been just really struck by how much of it is familiar, both from memories, but also from my practice over the last few years, and how grateful I am to you. Actually, that's I guess the first thing I'm need to get that out and share with you, Bill. A couple of things have really struck me, actually, and I wanted to come back to one of the points that Anne Welsh made earlier about the masculine and the feminine energy. And I've added the word energy because more recently I have been tuning into the energies in organization and becoming more aware of my own energies, my experience of energy in organizations. And as I speak to you or hear you speak today and hear some of these comments, I'm becoming really, really aware of the masculine energy that does exist in organizations. And I reflect on the anthropology of how we were. So, what was civilization like tens of thousands of years ago, or more actually, where there's more of a circular feminine that's about holding and containment and community and tribalism. And then the masculine energy, which is far more about achievement, hunting and gathering, making sure that there was enough for us to eat and be nourished. And having studied some of this over the last few years, and having actually then, and I loved, Bill, by the way you described this organizational processes, organizations as social processes, and the embodied approach, because the embodied piece is something that I'm becoming extremely tuned into and working with. That energy is really clear for me now. And it's not about gender, even though there's feminine, we could talk about sun and moon, we could talk about yin and yang, but those energies are distinct. And I guess hearing this today has really brought home the feminine yin moon energy that you and a lot of these pioneers that you've been mentored by or worked with, that you've shared with us today, which I'm very familiar with, but being reminded of, it's at the fore. And I don't think it's something that is talked about or explored sufficiently or in organizations. And the unconscious of our organizations create barriers for us to engage. So thank you. And I'm currently really getting into much more embodied processes to help us get into that unconscious. But the reminders of this conversation today have made that purpose even more important to me. So thank you.
Thank you, Samri. I'm just aware that Jean, you put something in the in the chat, and I was thinking you phrase it as a question to put to Bill, and I'd ask you, rather than putting it a question to Bill, whether you'd reflect on it yourself.
Yes, sure. So I'm slightly sorry, I'm babbling. I've just written a book myself called The Tao of Complexity. So I wasn't really wanting to quite say that, but I've said it now. And in that I've been working on a kind of processual ontology that's informed by complexity. So it's a reframing of complexity, very much more connected with what Bill's saying than some of the kind of ways of describing complexity. So in that, I've a bit like Bill's saying, I've kind of worked for many times. I have a whole bit on beliefs as well. I feel exactly the same about beliefs. And then Bill's just come up with almost all the words in my little model of it. He's talked about patterns. You've talked a lot about patterns of relationships, which has become quite central to the way I see things: systemic, emergent, all those kind of words. I've used punctuated because I went through all the P's until I gave up, but non-linear. But the one that's really come out for me is to do with the paradoxical nature of the world, that in this left brain way that Samreen was talking about, the sort of, there's a left brain, right brain is another way of saying that. There's a kind of, implicit view in the left brain thinking that there is a objective rational world out there, and all we have to do is kind of find it, measure it, control it, etc., and then all will be well. Whereas many of the important questions in life are paradoxical. So, it's important to value the individual. It's also important to value the collective, and the paradox is, where do I sit in this moment on this issue between honouring myself and honouring you, and pleasing myself and pleasing you? There's a sort of paradox of, do we focus on the short term and then we win in certain ways? That's a very strong thing at the moment. Who cares about climate change? We'll just make profit now, or we'll be a politician and please everybody because we'll have growth. It's and until we embrace paradox in our intentions, and also paradox in the fact that the world is not, what are the edges of these patterns? Who are the dominant players here? These are subjective, paradoxical issues. They're not just, it's not up to, there's a sort of critical subjectivity about them, but there is a kind of paradox. So that was what I'm sure Bill would, I'd just like to hear what Bill would think back at that, if that's possible, or anybody else. Does paradox seem an important aspect of being in the world, that we shy away from paradox? But even quantum physics, tells us that, things are kind of in relationship.
I'll just say two quick things, because enough of me I was reminded by George Mead, who said, the individual is a singular and the group is the plural of the same process. So that in itself is a paradox. You can't separate the individual and the group. We are one and the same. We're always being created and are created by groups. So that's in itself a paradox. And Ralph talked a lot about paradox. The core paradox for leaders is that they don't know what the consequences of their actions are going to be, and yet they need to act. So those would be my only two comments. And the other thing I wanted to say, by the way, Samreen, what's happened to your American accent? Where has that gone? I used to know Samreen in Ashley's Consulting, and she had a pure and unsullied American accent, which she's either allowed to be shaped by a variety of other accents.
I will just respond to that. So I've got 2 children who correct my accent.
Back to you, John.
I wonder if I could, sorry, make a comment. Shadi here. Hello, everyone who I know and who I completely miss from the good old days. I love coming to these sessions because it makes me think. And I thought, as somebody who's inside an organization, I always struggle with the intellectual part of my thinking and the practical stuff I need to do as a manager, whatever the role is. And I kind of sit between those. And you made me think, Bill, when you talked about the virtual versus the in-person. And I think as organizations, we haven't dealt with the impact of COVID and what happened. And rather than deal with it, we now say to people, you have to come in 3 days a week. That's doing, right? Come and be here and it will fix itself somehow. And I think we still are in the middle of figuring out that actually the human interaction is so important. We somehow have to figure it out, but we haven't. We're really baby steps, but we jumped into doing straight away. As you said, life is unpredictable. Anxiety is inevitable, and we displace anxiety by activity. So we just went, let's just do stuff. But thank you. It's been lovely to help my thinking. I love this session. I love you to see you, of course. So
I experience it like fresh air. You've brought us some fresh air in. And I think what I mean, what I think about that as well is that you've trained as a psychotherapist at one time, you know, as a Gestalt therapist. That makes a huge difference to our consciousness. And I think a lot of consultants or executive coaches now haven't been trained in psychotherapy. So they're not able to go as deeply into themselves in order to meet the other appropriately in the here and now. So thank you, and do more.
I'd
love to just, sorry.
No, you, Trish, you keep on, but I'm just going to ask, somebody has just used the word COMS, and I'm going to ask them what I've been asked to ask what that means. So, Trish, if you can speak now, and then the person who came up with the comms scheme can either put in the chat or spell out what they meant by that.
Okay, so very briefly, I just wanted to add my thanks. It's now 9:15 in Sydney. And I wanted to say, Bill, that, you know, I'm in Sydney because an organization flew me down last week to sit with them in a circle for 5 days with no slides. And I acquired the courage to do that when I did AMOC in 2008. So I just want to thank you sincerely.
Lovely, lovely. So we are making a difference. Fantastic.
Yeah.
I'm interested, Trish, and how did you create the contract where that became possible?
Well, I guess it's a long story. Most of my clients are people that I worked with previously. I used to work in Pfizer, pharmaceutical company. So I don't have a website, but the people that I've worked with know that I sit in circles and talk about what's here and now. And they keep inviting me back to do that. And they find it refreshing. And Yeah, so Bill, I suspect you underestimate the impact you've had. I'm sure everybody on the screen has those stories and that reality. So thank you.
I've had nothing back on the comms thing yet. Other voices? I'm going to sort of, in about 5 minutes, Bill, I'm going to ask you to reflect on both how you've experienced this conversation and if any other little good thoughts have occurred to you that you think, I really would like to say this. But I'll come back to you in about 5 minutes.
Alex,
John, I just wanted to add a small thing. Hi, Bill. It's Alex Poppleton.
Yeah.
I had the privilege of joining Ashbridge Consulting and sharing an office with you and Karen Vanstone. And I just wanted to add a different voice of the sort of all the fantastic things I learned from you and that were happening in AC at the time, but also how your kind of irreverence to what we were trying to do and how much we laughed and how much you brought the sense of us not taking ourselves too seriously. I think on the one hand, trying to change the world in lots of ways, and we were all very serious about that. But on the other hand, you always brought that sense of yes, and popping that, you know, popping that ego, and we always laughed at each other and how ludicrous it all was. So thank you for that, and you brought some of that today. It's lovely to see you.
Yeah, maybe I could follow on that, Alex. This is Andrew Chandler. Bill, long time no see.
Indeed.
So I was part of AMOC 2, which I think that was over 24 years ago. And Bill, I think before that, I'd met you and David, and you've done some work with us. And I think what I'm most struck by today is there is a humility and a vulnerability in the way you present yourself in the world. And I'm just struck with gratitude right here, because you've sort of reconnected me today to my purpose and got me thinking about the intention we have in how we intervene. How do we intervene in the system? What's really important to us? And particularly your question about, are we making a difference? And I don't know about others in this community, but I think for a lot of my clients, I notice people are in a bit of a hurry, right? We want pragmatic solutions with hard outcomes, and we want it now. And that sort of rush to result, right, often gets in the way of us deepening the conversation. So I don't know what others think about that. I'd be curious. But anyway, let me just say thank you to you, Bill. You've had a huge impact.
Thank you. Right, let's go say any last points of this before I ask Bill to share.
Well, there is one question actually, John, that you might just want to around if you were to start AMOC again, what would you have done differently or not? And what do you think is needed now in developing OD or OD consulting practice for the future, given the world we're in? So a minor, small little thing. And I would just like to say we are, you know, if we can kind of give you a couple of minutes to answer that, but then we'll start pulling things to a close. So if you could just encapsulate all of that tiny question.
Sorry, Bill, that's from me at the end.
One is supposed to say, in answer to these questions, all the things you, on reflection, would have done differently. But first of all, actually, I wouldn't have done it any differently. I mean, AMOC, to be honest, has been my, I was going to say proudest achievement. I think it was a really good course when it was going. And so I wouldn't have done anything differently. And of course, it's also, we can't do things differently retrospectively, can we? We respond to the situation that we had at the time. So I could tell you some domestic details about how I might have changed the faculty around a bit, but I'm not going to go there. What was the other part of the question?
The other part was about what do you think is needed now in developing OD consulting practice for the future, given the world we're in?
Well, we've got a community of people here. And personally, and again, this may sound a bit hubristic, but I have laid out, and I'm quite sure GameShift has laid out, the broad principles of an OD practice. Now, what at the moment, OD is too often associated with redesign. I notice OD is no longer the OD it was when I became OD. So I'm at the wrong end of my career now, but I would encourage, we need a group of OD people who are practicing OD in the way that I am and you are talking about it. Now, I don't know how you make that happen, but we need a better body of OD people. You're not going to find it in the big four, big five, because it's not the easiest way to make money, but some kind of community of OD practitioners, rather like they had in the States when OD first started, somehow find a new spirit of OD informed by seeing organizations of social processes. That's what I would encourage. But that's up to people like Chris and Philippa, and also you've got some colleagues like Talik, and Andrew has been on here. So maybe you could collaborate a bit more to create more of a what's the sense, a tipping point of OD people in the UK at least. So that would be my response to that.
Well, I'm just going to suggest closing it down now. Chris, Philippa, anything you'd like to say at this point?
Well, actually, before we finish the thanks to Bill thing, I've got, we've dealt with all the really massive stuff, but there's also some really practical stuff Bill taught me, which I have to just play back to you, because they live with me every day. And I don't even know if I'm quoting you accurately. Play the smallest possible role in a system consistent with still being paid. Was that you?
No.
See, I've been quoting that all over the place.
Can I add to that? Well, in a way, what I used to say is, remember, you're just joining an organization and then leaving it. We tend to create beginnings and ends, which are entirely artificial. So you're just turning up. So it's a slightly similar thing.
Yeah, and find out what your client's dress code is and then dress one notch down from it.
That's not me either.
He's been attributing it to you for years, but the one about consistent with getting paid gets changed for the client's benefit into consistent with getting the work done. The slightest possible, impact. Touch.
Yeah, just so you know,
Philip,
we are recording this, so now you've just it's public now.
And I won't even comment on the dress one. But Bill, thank you very much indeed for your time. We really appreciate that. Can I just ask, this is not what we normally do, but given that we have so many friends here, can you just take yourselves off mute and can we just say thank you to Bill so that he can actually hear us doing it rather than
That's nice. Yeah.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just before we go, Chris, do you just want to say a final couple of words?
In fact, no, I want John to say a final couple of words, because the next pop-up in our series is John and Megan on January the 22nd. So, John, spaciousness, I believe.
It is. It's and it ties into this. How do we step out of the cult of busyness? So for the last 18 months to 2 years, Megan and I have been building on our work on various things, and we've just been asking people, what does the word spaciousness mean to them? Which opens up all sorts of interesting observations. And I'm just a couple of quotes that came to my mind as I was listening to everyone talk. Was a Norwegian guy once said, if you remember from ancient Greek thing, is Sisyphus may have been a happy man pushing his rock up the mountain every day. And it is, again, it's the idea that keeping yourself very, very busy allows you to avoid all sorts of existential questions. And then it also, some of the other quotes, I've got to make sure I don't break confidentiality on this. We spoke to somebody who was a head of L&D in a particular organization that you all know. And they said that when people come on the training they run, it's recorded on the timesheets as non-productive time. So he described himself as the director in charge of non-productive time. And one last thing on that is one of the other bits, because we had to get some quants in, because we know that's how you buy a lot of validity while holding quantification in high skepticism, is, what are the type of conversations people like having? They like having conversations about task massively. What are the conversations they know they need to have? They're all about meaning, relationships, and learning. And what are the ones they won't stop having? The ones about task. So again, these are the sort of themes that we'll be touching on and sharing with you.
Brilliant. We're looking forward to it. As usual, we will send out a link to the recording of this one and an invitation to the next one. And we'll also do a flyer about some of the pop-ups that are coming in the first half of 2025, because we have a really fascinating agenda coming up. So I'm really excited by what's coming next year. Philippa, is there anything you'd like to say to finish this off?
No, just to say thank you very much. Wonderful to see so many people, and have a good rest of the day or the rest of the evening, depending where you are in the world.
Thank you, folks.
Bye, everybody. Nice to meet you.